Hakim, who is the ICU doctor, wrote about in the Federalist is that most ICU doctors look for patterns. And he points out that if you have somebody here that has urinary tract infection, or somebody that has had antibiotic resistance, or somebody that's a diabetic, you tend to put them in categories because you, over time, have learned what works and what doesn't work. And he said this almost reminds you of that cliche that you've seen in many a movie where the doctor or the scientist looks up from the microscope and says, this doesn't seem to behave like anything I've ever seen before. And so this very interesting, novel, highly contagious virus is really starting to baffle a number of individuals. And one of the things he talks about is the fact that we have people that sometimes are suffocating to death without realizing it. And so you can see individuals that come in and have low oxygen levels, but they don't necessarily complain about shortness of breath, but all of a sudden, boom, it hits them, and they don't even realize how sick they might be. He points out, too, that another very weird thing about COVID-19 is that the very old in our ICU died in a few days, which means you're left oftentimes with people that are 50-something, 60-something, 70-something who stay on the ventilator for weeks. And he says we're totally at the mercy of this disease, watching the lungs get better, and then the next day much worse. And he then points out that he's tried different things. You know, we know about remdesivir, which we talked about on Friday, and a number of other drugs, as well as plasma and anticoagulation and cytosporine and all those kinds of things, he says, but nothing dramatically works, and that is of concern. And then the other one is, as we just pointed out, some of these people stay on these ventilators for weeks, and he says this is a pattern of causing ICU paralysis by loading up ventilators and beds with people who don't quite get better for weeks. And he says that's kind of one of the major hidden stories of COVID-19. And then the others that we'll be talking about, and maybe not even this hour, but in the next hour when we have some more time away from our interviews, is the number of individuals who are dying or whose illnesses are getting worse because they don't want to go to the ER, they don't want to go to the hospital. And he said, I've seen multiple major illnesses leading to death that could have been easily prevented by patients coming in earlier. Family members told me the patients were reluctant to come and get exposed. And so that is the case. But after all of this conversation about medicine, I did appreciate the fact that he also recognizes you just can't keep the country locked down forever. So unlike maybe some that only focus on the science but don't think about the policy and recognize that even the, quote, science sometimes is killing other people who are locked down and not coming to emergency rooms, he says not ending the self-imposed quarantine will also lead to economic destruction with its own collateral damage, especially for people working paycheck to paycheck, and even to our own medical infrastructure, which, of course, as we were pointing out, is oftentimes subsidized by elective surgery, all of which has been canceled. So he says we probably will have to open the economy more and more because just in a couple of months we've entered historic levels of unemployment. And so he points out again that there is a lot of suffering and death in either direction. And he said it isn't a political party or a person doing this, it's the virus. So I thought it was a very intelligent look by an individual who, number one, wanted us to understand that this is not like some of the other viruses we run into. Number two, we're still trying to figure out what works and what doesn't work. And in most cases, we figured out what doesn't work. We haven't figured out what does work. And number three, unlike maybe some that only work in the medical field but don't think about public policy, he was also well aware we can't continue down this road indefinitely. So those are just a couple of issues that I thought we might post here, and some things that I thought would be worth considering as well. My second article is by Jason Kilmeyer, in which he refers to our endangered transfer of power. Now, I know it may be a little early to talk about this, but we do have an election coming up in November. We have a few more primaries that have been either postponed or instantaneously called. It's just amazing how all that's played out. But he does express a real concern that many of us around the table have had, and that is, if you look back over, say, the last 20 years, and I recognize that for our younger listeners, if you're not over the age of, say, like 35, you don't even remember the 2000 election, which was eventually decided by so-called hanging chads, 535 vote difference, and a Supreme Court decision. We have had a few of these now, and in some cases, that has also been a very difficult transfer of power. He reminds us, and I'd forgotten this until he reminded us of this, that when the Clinton administration left and the Bush administration came in, a lot of the staffers found that the W keys were removed from the staffer keyboards, because it's George W. Bush, and because of the contentious election. Then the transfer of power from George W. Bush to Obama was pretty good. And to be fair, I think Barack Obama at least originally wanted to have a natural, easy transfer of power from him to Donald Trump. But once Trump won, because he was thinking this would be a natural transfer of power to, of course, Hillary Clinton, then you have one of the least clean transfers of power, something we'll talk about in just a minute when we get into everything from Michael Flynn, the Russian investigation, and all the rest. But the point that Jason is making is we're in a country that's even more divided than it was 20 years ago, and we can see what happened when you had a contentious election electing George W. Bush over Al Gore. We just had 3.5 years ago a contentious election when you surprisingly, to most people's surprise, elected Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton. At this point now, he says, we just may not be able to endure another transfer of power if indeed this becomes close. And reminds us that just 2 years ago, you had a gubernatorial candidate, that would be in Georgia, who stated that without any evidence that she lost her race due to voter suppression. And so now we have a move towards even more possibility of voter fraud. And I'll come back to this in just a minute, because indeed, you have a lot of mail-by-vote situations that are taking place in a number of states, more being pushed. And he makes the case that indeed we could have such a contentious transfer of power that it may really rock this republic. And he says, if this sounds like hyperbole, ask yourself what percentage of Americans will later this year accept a Bush versus Gore Supreme Court decision like they did 20 years ago. And I think the answer is very, very few indeed, because he reminds us that even after the election of Donald Trump, you had people going into the streets in 2016 protesting that when it wasn't even decided by a Supreme Court decision. And so you're going to, if nothing else, say that if anything, we really would hope that the 2020 election would be a landslide. Because then at that point, you might have a few people protesting it, a few people maybe criticizing those who voted for whichever candidate. But if it is close, and if we get to something as close even as the 2000 election, or he also reminds us that even in the 2004 election, George Bush beat John Kerry in Ohio by 51% to 49%. You can see that we could have something that could really begin to rock this republic. And it's something to think about now while we're still kind of looking ahead to what would happen in November. But if we end up with a very close, contentious election in November, not just for the presidency, but for the House of Representatives, 435 races, 34 U.S. Senate races, as well as more than a dozen different governor's races and state legislative races, we could be in for some real controversy. So, again, it's the second article that we've posted on the website. Thought you would like to read it, and when we come back, we'll get into one or two more issues, and then we'll spend some time talking with Curtis Ellis about how to react to what has been happening in communist China. especially with this virus and especially with all sorts of other things that we've been concerned about coming out of China over the last few years. And so we will come back and spend some time talking with him. Then we'll get back into some of these other issues in the news. All that coming up right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and let me just, if I can, talk real quickly about a comment or two by the former President Barack Obama on Michael Flynn, then former Representative Trey Gowdy pointing out some of the things having to do with Adam Schiff, and perhaps one of the things that everybody's talking about, just the way in which not only NBC, but then later CBS and a variety of others just completely edited an interview with the Attorney General Bill Barr, and it illustrates, again, media bias, or if you want to be really generous and say, no, they were not biased, they just made a mistake, so that'd be media malpractice. Either way, we'll talk about that. We talk about former President Barack Obama. One of the surprises for me has been that he hasn't really said very much. I mean, I was convinced, and most of the people around this table were convinced, and all sorts of other talk shows were convinced, that all through the Trump campaign, all through the Trump presidency, even as we are now coming into what eventually would be the re-election campaign, that we'd be hearing on a regular basis from President Barack Obama. We did not. So let's give him some credit. He has been as quiet about speaking about Donald Trump as his predecessor, George W. Bush, has. And I've always felt that it is not really the place for the former president to come on to various news shows and programs to criticize the current president. And the people that have done this, I think, the best have been both of the Bushes. And certainly Barack Obama, until recently, has really said very little about Donald Trump. Every once in a while, he's taken a shot, but surprisingly not until now. And I think there is a very good reason for that. He's been speaking about Michael Flynn. And if you remember our conversation from Friday, we pointed out that there were some meetings where those individuals with the FBI met at the Oval Office, obviously including the president, in a sense, how to deal with Michael Flynn. And Michael Flynn has been something that Donald Trump has, of course, had to deal with. And it was interesting that when Barack Obama met with Donald Trump, and always the outgoing president gives advice to the incoming president, there were only really two things that Barack Obama talked about. And one of those was you probably just need to not take the advice of Michael Flynn. Now, a lot of people took that as, well, he just didn't get along with him very much because he gave bad information to Barack Obama. Then the theory was, well, Michael Flynn was wanting to completely restructure the intelligence community, so maybe some of Barack Obama's friends were there. And now more recently, we've talked about another one, and that is Andrew McCarthy points out that Michael Flynn was the impediment to the ongoing investigation of Donald Trump on the Russian collusion. But for whatever reason, all of a sudden, Barack Obama, former president, has begun speaking on Michael Flynn. And interestingly enough, was in a phone call the other day with about 3,000 members of what's called the Obama Alumni Association. These are people that are very close to Barack Obama, served with him, or in one way served with him in either the campaign or, most importantly, in the administration. And this is what the editors of the Wall Street Journal said. Barack Obama is a lawyer, so it's stunning to read that he ventured into the Michael Flynn case in a way that misstated the supposed crime and ignored the history of his own administration in targeting Michael Flynn. As a matter of fact, Barack Obama said, there is no precedent that anybody can find for someone who has been charged with perjury just getting off scot-free. Well, all sorts of commentators have had fun with this today, but let me just read the Wall Street Journal because I think theirs is good enough. And that is, even discounting Barack Obama's partisan audience, this case he gets willfully wrong. Mr. Flynn was never charged with perjury. By the way, that is true, by the way, which is lying under oath in a legal proceeding. He later decided to acknowledge misstating or lying to some of the individuals in a meeting in the White House, but that is not perjury by any stretch of the imagination. And so, first of all, it's not perjury. Number two, I love what the Wall Street Journal says, scot-free. You know, that better applies to former President Bill Clinton, who lied under oath in a civil case and was impeached for perjury, but was acquitted by the Senate. But we understand why Mr. Obama might not want to bring that up. But again, they go on to say that if the former president does read the Justice Department motion, he'll find disconcerting facts that certainly do raise doubts about whether our basic understanding of the rule of law is at risk, because they said start with the violation in which Mr. Obama knows is a legal obligation for the prosecution to turn over potentially exculpatory evidence to the defense. What does that mean? That's a big word for evidence that actually undermines your case. Yet prosecutors led by special counsel Robert Mueller did not disclose that at any time, that they actually did not think that Mr. Flynn lied about a phone call about the Russian ambassador. He just didn't mention one part of that phone call. Worst of all, as a legal matter, they never told Mr. Flynn that there was no investigative evidentiary basis to justify the interview. And, of course, all of this is part of this attempt to create and continue this Russian collusion idea. And so all of a sudden you're starting to see President Barack Obama talking about how Donald Trump has botched the response to the coronavirus, has begun speaking out about how this particular decision by the Justice Department is a miscarriage of justice. And it's reminiscent, for those of you in the state of Texas, of what they used to say in West Texas, If you throw a rock in a pack of dogs, the one that yelps is the one that got hit. And that is, I think the former president, recognizes that as now more and more of these documents are coming out, it doesn't look so good for him. And so this may be a way to have some kind of distraction. And while we're talking about that, I'll skip over some of the Trey Gowdy stuff and use that in the next hour. Probably the best example that a lot of people have found over the last few days of media bias had to do with an interview that was done with the Attorney General, Bill Barr, about the decision to drop the case against Michael Flynn. And so what you see here are all sorts of people now posting edits and tweets and things like that. This one comes from one individual saying, very disappointed by the deceptive editing and commentary by Chuck Todd on Meet the Press. And what it is that there was a question asked about the Attorney General having to do with their decision to drop this case against Michael Flynn. And so you see this video where the Attorney General, Bill Barr, says, do you think this will be actually viewed favorably in history? And so the Attorney General, Bill Barr, says, well, history is written by the winners, so it largely depends on who's writing the history. And that's all you see. And so then you have, of course, Chuck Todd coming back and saying, it's amazing. He didn't even talk about the rule of law of anything. But actually, if you look at the whole clip, and you can find these all over the internet right now, after having said that, Bill Barr goes on to say, but I think the fair history would say that it is a good decision because it upheld the rule of law. It helped it. It upheld the standards of the Department of Justice, and it undid what was injustice. So you have right now Chuck Todd saying, he didn't even talk about the idea of the rule of law when the very next sentence talked about the rule of law, and it was not in that particular clip. Now, if you then go and watch how the mainstream press continue this, the several clips which were posted by CBS were then posted by NBC. And so anybody watching NBC, CBS, or any of the others will think that all the Attorney General said is, well, history's written by the winners, and that's it. They will miss the part in which he actually spent the time talking about the fact that this actually is a way to uphold the rule of law. So if you're looking for a good example of bias, that's the case. Or maybe some people just made a mistake, and that would be media malpractice. But if you're hearing people talking about how Meet the Press and Chuck Todd did not treat the Attorney General well, that's what you're hearing about. Probably one of the better examples that we can use from the weekend of media bias, or, if you want to be generous, media malfeasance. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after this.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us for the Monday edition of Point of View, and we have certainly a lot to talk about over the next couple of hours. A little bit later this hour, we'll get into the whole issue of the coronavirus and a very good piece that I've posted from an ICU doctor who, on the one hand, recognizes there's just a lot that we still do not know about this virus, and so some real concerns. But on the other hand, I think at least understands that locking down the government and locking down the economy just isn't going to work either. So I think it's a very well-written, balanced piece. We'll get into a couple of other issues, some good examples of media bias over the weekend that you need to know about, and much more. But first, I thought this hour we would focus about a half an hour on the subject of China. It is not a new topic. As a matter of fact, we've in the past had a Gordon Chang in studio and even by phone, and we've talked about this. We've even given you an action item a while back where we encouraged you to click on our Take Action item on protecting our pharmaceutical supply chain and letting your two members of the U.S. Senate know that you thought that this particular piece of legislation by Senator Tom Cotton is a good idea. And even Friday, we talked about another one, a bill in the House put together by Representative Chip Roy. So we have certainly been talking about this for some time. And, of course, in the past, we've talked about the desire by the president to move factories out of China, imposing tariffs. But now that we know so much more about communist China because of this virus, I thought it would be really good to bring back to the microphone Curtis Ellis. He is the senior policy advisor, has been for Donald Trump, and an individual that we have information about on his particular website, America First Policies. And, of course, we've had him on the program in the past when we've talked about such things as the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And so we bring him back to the phone. And, Curtis, thank you so very much for joining us today here on Point of View.
It's a great pleasure to be speaking with you, Kerby. Thanks for having me.
I know you were on with Rick Roberts the other day, and that's when I thought we need to get you on. And by the way, I might just mention also that we have posted your piece on common sense on communist China, because that also is something. Why is it that we see when it becomes pretty obvious that we should not have communist China be our friend, since oftentimes it looks like an enemy? Why is it that you have people that go along with that? So we'll get to that in just a minute. But talk about what you've developed right now at America First Policies, because you're really encouraging people to let your elected representatives know that we've got to, as we've talked about with Gordon Chang, decouple the United States from China. Tell us more.
Yes, there's a whole host of legislation moving through Congress right now. It seems everybody has come up with a bill addressing the problem of communist China, and I applaud your efforts to draw attention to this. And every American should be getting behind this legislation, whether it's Tom Cotton's legislation and Marco Rubio's legislation to get our supply chains, our medical supply chains out of China. Tom Cotton has similar legislation. Josh Hawley is now calling for the U.S. to withdraw from the World Trade Organization, which we can save that for a future broadcast. What I've been writing about lately is a broad-based boycott China. I mean, let's be clear here.
Yes.
The United States of America was founded in a trade war. Our gripe with Great Britain was partially political in that we were being ruled by a faraway country and a parliament that would not allow us to basically have representation in that parliament, and we were being subjugated economically. The rule of the aim of the British Empire was to have the colonies be a market for the goods that were manufactured in Great Britain. Great Britain at that time was the workshop of the world, and the colonies were supposed to be, number one, a source of raw materials, and number two, a market for the manufactured goods. And they had specific policies in place to cripple our ability to manufacture and make anything. They did that on purpose, and they said that's what they were doing. They said, we will strangle any industry in the colonies. The industry is to be in Great Britain, and they are supposed to buy the stuff that we make. And when the Crown put in place the Stamp Act and the Townshend Act and the Tea Act, what we did, the first thing the colonists did, the Americans did, was boycott the manufactured goods coming out of Britain. And it created widespread unemployment in Great Britain, and they had to repeal the Townshend Act, which placed tariffs. The British placed a tariff on Americans buying China and all textiles and everything that was made in Britain at the time. And the Americans said, we're not going to buy it, we're not going to pay that tax, and we're just not going to buy anything. And this strangled the British Crown's effort to monopolize industry. And you have to remember that the Tea Act, same thing, and that the tea that the Sons of Liberty threw into Boston Harbor was deliberately underpriced to the colonial merchants' tea. It was cheaper. So here we have the first example of cheaper foreign-made goods being rejected by the American people. They said, we would rather buy tea from our own people and pay more than to have cheaper product from Great Britain. So what we're saying with Boycott China, the slogan, the idea is this is aspirational as well as actual. We have to send a message to our legislators. It's time to act and start bringing manufacturing out of China back to the United States as close home as possible. And it's sending a message to corporations that we will not buy something made in China. We will look for something made anywhere else. Anywhere else. If it's a Samsung TV made in South Korea or Taiwan or another brand made in China, we'll take the Samsung TV. We'll take the other TV made in Taiwan. Unfortunately, there are no television sets left being made in America anymore. Sadly. That's terrible. We lost that decades ago. And it's sending a message to Wall Street that you shouldn't be investing our retirement funds in Chinese companies, because that's happening a lot now. A lot of these state pension funds, teacher pension funds, and there was even a move afoot for federal employees and active duty military retirement funds to be invested in these index funds, right? Passive investment. There's emerging market index fund, a large component of which was Chinese companies, defense contractors, surveillance spy companies. I mean, just unbelievable that we would even entertain the notion of investing in companies that are engaged in this type of activity. But that's the kind of blindness that rules Washington. Yes. That's why we need to send a loud and clear message: boycott China.
Let's take a break. We're asking people. Yeah, I'm going to take a break, and I've got a mandatory break. I'm going to come back and talk a little bit more about that. And again, as much as we are encouraging you to contact your elected representatives about many of these pieces of legislation, you don't have to wait. You can actually decide right now to make that choice. And, and there used to be, back in the 1930s, as this article points out, a Buy American kind of philosophy, which we have lost, but maybe it's back to individual consumers like you making individual choices, but also sending a signal not only to your elected representatives, but also to people in Wall Street. China's not our friend, and actually, in some cases, has been our enemy. Let's continue our conversation with Curtis Ellis right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The latest issue of Harvard University's magazine has an article by the faculty director of the Child Advocacy Program blasting homeschool as dangerous. She documents what she sees as the risks of homeschooling and is disturbed that parents can exercise authoritarian control over their kids. It might be tempting to merely write this off as just another radical professor expressing an opinion that isn't necessarily shared by others on the faculty. But consider that Harvard Magazine's cover features this article and that the university is hosting a conference in June of experts who will be willing to raise the alarm of the dangers of homeschooling. One guest to my radio program talked about how this would progress. State legislators would introduce bills to control homeschooling. Then they would point to the Harvard conference and academic articles warning about homeschooling in order to win over fellow legislators and governors. The article in Harvard Magazine argues that parents want to homeschool their kids in order to isolate them from ideas and values central to our democracy. Actually, surveys done of homeschool parents find that a concern about the school environment, such as safety, drugs, or negative peer pressure, was the number one reason. The number two reason was dissatisfaction with the academic instruction at other schools. Over the last few weeks, I've argued on air that the current lockdown that requires students to stay home have shown parents two things. First, how hard their kids' teachers have to work to educate their kids. Second, how much better their kids' behavior is when at home and away from some of the negative influences in public school. Some of those parents might conclude that homeschooling is better for their kids, which is why some educational elites are starting to warn about the dangers of homeschooling. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again with Curtis Ellis, and let me just encourage you to go to his website, americafirstpolicies.org. You can find out a lot more information. And in just a minute, I also want to go to this article on common sense on communist China. Why is it that some individuals, knowing what China has been doing, and again, we're not talking about all Chinese people. We love the Chinese people, but the Communist Chinese Party has been so detrimental to our future and really wants to control the world. But before we do that, let me come back, Curtis, to the issue that I'm sure is everybody's mind. It was a conversation we had during the break, and that is, buying America and boycotting China is difficult because if you walk into a Walmart, you walk into a Home Depot, first of all, sometimes you have to look for a long time to find something that's American-made since a lot of it's Chinese-made. And second of all, sadly, a lot of Americans, not me, but a lot of Americans will say, I'd rather buy the cheap one rather than pay the extra dollars for the American-made one. So we need to kind of change people's behavior. They need to first start looking for American products, and number two, be willing to pay more for them. True?
That is true. The second part is not so difficult as the first. I've spoken with many people, but more importantly, we've done significant survey research. I've been involved in polling over the years, and people are willing to pay a little bit more for American-made goods. And what we're saying right now is I'm quite aware of the fact that we have gutted manufacturing in America for so long that there are some products that are just not made in America. You can't find it. So if you have to buy something made in Mexico rather than made in China, what the idea is, do it, because what we're trying to do is starve the Chinese Communist Party, not the Chinese people, as you point out. Our gripe is not with the Chinese people. It's with the Communist Party, which is tyrannizing its own people as well as ours.
Yes.
And we have to cut off the blood supply to the tumor that is the Chinese Communist Party. And its blood supply is money, Western capital. When they go around the world buying things, setting up their military bases, they're paying in dollars that we gave them. President Trump said he's going to make China pay. He wants China to pay for the damages caused by the pandemic. And they said, are you going to present them a bill? And he said, well, we have better ways of doing it, easier ways of doing it. Simple. Don't give them the money that we'd ask them to give back to us in the form of damages. Just don't give it to them in the first place. That happens with the government, happens with corporations. They have to move their supply chains out of China, and it happens with consumers. We can make the choice to just buy anywhere but China, ABC, anything, anywhere but China. And 5 of China's top 10 exports to the United States, 5 of the top 10 exports of the things that China exports to the United States are also available from Mexico.
There you go.
So there you go. It's not as difficult. You have to look a little bit more, but consider what our dependency on that atheistic, materialistic, totalitarian regime has cost us. That we have seen the true price of those low prices. We have seen the true cost of the cheaper Chinese goods. We can't even protect ourselves. If you had an individual, if you knew an individual who couldn't feed themselves, couldn't clothe themselves, and couldn't give themselves medicine that they needed to survive, you would call that person an invalid. And that's what we've become as a nation. And this is not by accident. It is by design. The Chinese Communist Party is waging unrestricted warfare on the United States, and a key part of the strategy is economic warfare. Unfortunately, too many people have gone along with it in this country, and I'm not talking about individuals now. Corporations, whether it's the big 3 auto manufacturers, whether it's food processors, whether it's hospital groups, they would pass over American producers, American factories, small and medium-sized independent companies that are in the food production or in the manufacturing supply chain. They'd pass them over and go overseas for a lower price. And when fully aware that if they weren't here in the good times, if these companies would be starved without customers, they go out of business, right? And they weren't, so they put them out of business by going overseas and buying something cheaper. And now they're not there when we need them. We can't produce the medical gear that we need, and we're starting to see food shortages. Even as food exports to China are skyrocketing, they're at record levels, we're starting to see shortages in this country because our own producers have been frozen out. Now, it used to be, as you were saying before the break, the law required, by law, the federal government was required to buy American when it went shopping for the military. We had to buy American. Our armed forces, when they went shopping, let's say for antibiotics, for the medics, the antibiotics had to be made in America. The shoes had to be made in America. The uniforms had to be made in America. That meant jobs for textile workers. It meant jobs for cotton growers. It meant jobs for up and down the line. And slowly but surely, those laws were gutted. Their waivers were issued, and okay, in this instance, you can buy someplace else. You can go overseas and get it cheaper. As recently as 2018, in the Defense Appropriations Act, a senator posed an amendment trying to further gut the Buy American requirements for the military. And at that point, and I'm not making this up, the example he cited was, why should the military buy American when it can get something cheaper overseas? For example,
there you go. Yeah.
The antidote to nerve gas. Right now, the Pentagon is buying the antidote to nerve gas from a small company in Maryland. And they said, no, don't do that. Buy that overseas. Well, that company in Maryland would go out of business. And then when our troops need an antidote to nerve gas, we'd be begging China to please give it to us.
It's just incredible. You know, just before we go, let me just mention that the article we've posted also helps us understand why we don't have more people taking your side or the side that most of us on Point of View have. And you talk about the vested. And, of course, you can understand when you're talking about some of the media, they want to get that over there. But we learned with the NBA that all of a sudden, you know, somebody with the Houston Rockets makes a comment and everybody falls over themselves trying to not offend China. So you talk about the vested, you talk about the weak, you talk about those who are prejudiced and even the moderates. So this is an article that we've posted because I just wanted people to maybe even, as they're saying, why is it that we don't have more people speaking out like Curtis? Well, there's a good answer to that. But just before we go, I wanted to have people know what they can find when they go to your website, americafirstpolicies.org, because there's some great material there. And, of course, the first step is to start boycotting China. And you make choices every day about products. Why don't you choose America First? But more importantly, you've got all sorts of other great information on your website. So what will they find when they land there?
We are America First Policies. We are the officially sanctioned by the White House. We are President Trump does fundraisers for us. We consult with him all the time. You'll find background on all of the legislation that puts America first, to build America a united country, a strong country, and puts Americans first on immigration, on trade issues, whether it's the Mexico trade agreement, China, and you'll find all of my writings. I write for many different places, but they're all archived in the news section, and you'll see where we're going to be doing some events coming up. We've been traveling with the vice president before this pandemic broke out. So that's what you'll find at America First Policies. If you want to spread the word about boycott China, we have another website, getoutofchina.us. Getoutofchina.us, and you can get some stickers to put on your car and spread the word. That's over at getoutofchina.us. America First Policies, you'll find stuff on all kinds of different issues that to build a stronger America and really get us back where we should be, thinking about our country and our people rather than this sort of globalist project of no more countries anymore and it's one big happy socialist family worldwide.
So again, getoutofchina.us. And again, we have, of course, all the other links there as well that I think you're going to find helpful, and in americafirstpolicies.org. So, Curtis, thank you so very much for standing up for America, and thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you for everything you're doing, Kerby.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to get into the coronavirus for just a little bit. And you will probably see us revisit this topic again because, as we've pointed out, we gave you some action items to maybe contact your U.S. senators about Tom Cotton's bill, or, of course, Marco Rubio's bill, or a variety of others. There are quite a number of those out there. And then we maybe have some desire in the future to maybe have you contact your representative about the bill by Chip Roy and many others. There are just so many that are moving through Congress right now, all with the understanding that China isn't really our friend. Oftentimes it's our enemy, and so act accordingly. We'll take a break, talk about more right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Let's get back to some of the issues in the news. And, of course, we're going to spend most of our time this half hour talking about the pandemic. But before we do, I thought we'd focus on just a few other issues that are happening that we probably would have been talking about and should be talking about, even though we will focus a lot of our time and attention on the coronavirus. And you will see a couple of articles. One I've posted on the ICU doctor on the coronavirus, which I think you'll find very interesting and helpful. One on the endangered transfer of power, which we'll get back to some of the things that are more political. But let me just mention for a couple of minutes the fact that on Friday, we posted a piece by John Solomon in which he did a very in-depth analysis of the kinds of things that were said to the media. Most of these were leaks by Adam Schiff to the media, and the kind of statements being made, which now that we have these documents show that these were, I guess to be generous, you could say misrepresentations. Most people call them lies. But if nothing else, the other day, former Representative Trey Gowdy was on on one of the programs, and he was talking about actually all the different evidence that we now have about some of the leaks that were provided by Adam Schiff as it was sort of a run-up to the impeachment trials, and how it turns out how many of these reporters themselves repeated those without any further investigation. So when he was asked in this interview to maybe identify reporters who took leaks from Adam Schiff or stories related to the intelligence panel Russian investigation, he said, well, I hope you have a 3-hour show. Of course, he was being facetious, but only barely, because he said, okay, well, let's start with Politico. Kyle Cheney is just an acolyte for Adam Schiff, referring to the senior congressional reporter at the website. He then talked about CNN, Manu Raju. He said nothing Schiff wanted out made public. No leak was too low for him. Then he said, of course, fill in the blanks for the New York Times, a number of individuals in the New York Times that took these. And back a year ago, that would be March 31st, 2019, Trey Gowdy said in that interview that he'd wondered whether U.S. intelligence agencies could stop providing information to Adam Schiff because, that was his phrase, he leaks like a screen door on a submarine, which I thought was kind of interesting. So we are now having a chance, because of many of these documents that are surfacing, recognizing that all these comments, all of the kind of claims being made, none of them actually pass strict scrutiny once we look at the actual documents. So that certainly is the case. Which brings us to some of the comments being made by former President Barack Obama. Now, let's give him credit. The tendency and the tradition has usually been that for an outgoing president not to speak to the policies and actions of the current president. And I would have to say that whether it's George Herbert Walker Bush or George W. Bush, that was the case. And there were a lot of people that were concerned that as Barack Obama, former president, was setting up his office, he would be in the press constantly talking about what he would disagree with about the president. And he has pretty much been relatively quiet until now. And what has been so interesting is he is very critical of the president's handling of the coronavirus. But I wanted to focus on just one aspect of something we talked about on Friday, and that is the decision by the Justice Department to actually no longer carry on any prosecution of Michael Flynn, individual that, of course, is Lieutenant General and an individual that was the first national security advisor for Donald Trump, but was removed very quickly and then was forced to actually argue that he lied to the investigators in the White House. But what was so interesting is in the statement by former President Barack Obama, in a phone call that was made to about 3,000 members of what many people call the Obama Alumni Association, he made some really interesting comments. And one of those is he said, there's no precedent that anyone can find for someone who has been charged with perjury just getting off scot-free. Now, our friends at the Wall Street Journal, I think, took this on by saying, now, wait a minute, Barack Obama's a lawyer, so it's stunning, they said, to read that he ventured into the Michael Flynn case in a way that misstated the supposed crime and ignored the history of his own administration in targeting Mr. Flynn. You can take each one of those individually, so let's do so. First of all, he says, even discounting Mr. Obama's partisan audience, he gets this case willfully wrong. First of all, Mr. Flynn was never charged with perjury, which is lying under oath in a legal proceeding. Mr. Flynn pleaded guilty, or at least wanted to, but then withdrew that to a single count of lying to the FBI in a meeting at the White House on January 24th. As for scot-free, the editors of the Wall Street Journal put it this way, that better applies maybe to former President Bill Clinton, who did lie under oath in a civil case and was impeached for perjury but acquitted by the Senate. And it said, well, we can understand why Mr. Obama wouldn't bring that up. But no doubt Mr. Obama, they said, should read the Thursday Justice Department motion to drop the Flynn prosecution, because they said if he does read it, they'll find disconcerting facts that certainly do raise doubts about whether our basic understanding of the rule of law is at risk. Remember that phrase, because it's going to come back here in just a minute when we talk about the Attorney General, Bill Barr. But start with a prosecutional violation of what's called the Brady Rule, which Mr. Obama knows is a legal obligation that the prosecution must turn over potentially exculpatory evidence to the defense. Exculpatory means evidence that maybe undercuts your case but would be helpful to the defense. Yet prosecutors, led by special counsel Robert Mueller, didn't disclose the interviewing FBI agents at the time, really didn't even think that Michael Flynn had lied about the phone call with the Russian ambassador. Worst of all, as a legal matter, the editors of the Wall Street Journal say, they never told Mr. Flynn that there was no investigative evidentiary basis to justify the interview in the first place. And all of this, of course, was moved along politically by leaks to the media. We just talked about those a minute ago now, didn't we? That would be Adam Schiff and others, about Mr. Flynn's phone call with the Russians and the idea that, if nothing else, this was used to simply remove Michael Flynn from the White House. The argument used to be that this was because they were fearful that Michael Flynn, who already had expressed a desire to reorganize the intelligence community, might remove some of the friends of Barack Obama or the previous administration. But as we've also pointed out on this program, Andrew McCarthy has pointed out that probably the bigger reason was not that Michael Flynn was the target, Donald Trump was the target, but he was in the way because he would understand, having been in the intelligence community in the past, that there was this ongoing investigation of Donald Trump, and he would have uncovered that very quickly before later they found that out. So nevertheless, we're starting to see Barack Obama speaking out, and I think part of that may be because it's a political year, partly because he wants to maybe help his former vice president, Joe Biden, but also because before it's all through, maybe he's implicated because there was, after all, as we've talked about on a few occasions, that meeting in the Oval Office, which took place simply before you had a variety of individuals going to meet with Donald Trump, and the possibility that some of this was actually planned at the beginning. But while we're talking about this decision, the Justice Department to no longer prosecute Michael Flynn, there was perhaps one of, many people think, the best example we've had recently of media bias. And this actually happened on Meet the Press. There was an interview that was done with the Attorney General, William Barr, and the question was raised about, how history would look at this issue of no longer deciding to pursue an investigation and a prosecution of Michael Flynn. And in the interview, we saw on NBC's Meet the Press and also the interview on CBS, the statement by the Attorney General, well, history is written by the winner, so it largely depends on who's writing the history. And at that point, then the interview is stopped. And then you have these comments by Chuck Todd saying it's interesting that he actually never talked about upholding the rule of law. Well, if you go back and look at the entire interview, and it's all over the internet now so you can see it for yourself, after he made that initial statement, Attorney General Bill Barr actually said, but I think a fair history would say that it was a good decision because it upheld the rule of law, it upheld the standards of the Justice Department, and it undid what was an injustice. So if you watch the whole interview, you can see that that actually is where he did talk about the rule of law, and yet he was completely criticized by Chuck Todd for actually not talking about the rule of law. And so this interview, in its edited, highly edited place, ends up both in CBS News and in NBC News. And a lot of people have said, if you are looking for an example of media bias, you saw it this weekend in the highly edited and misedited interview with the Attorney General. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover. We will do so right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let's get back to the coronavirus. And then next hour, we're going to talk about Christians and the art and how we can think about the idea of art and beauty, creativity. And I think you're really going to enjoy the conversation. Reg Grant, Dr. Reg Grant will be in studio with us, as well as Steve Miller. We'll be talking about this idea of art and just kind of get us a bit of a break from some of the things that we seem to be talking about every single day. But let's get into it for just a few more minutes. My first article is entitled ICU Doctor on the Coronavirus. It's written by Alex Hakim, and it's in the Federalist, and I appreciated it because on the one hand, it was so honest about what we don't still know about this virus medically, but at the same time, he also recognizes, even though he's a doctor, that we just can't keep this country locked down. We're having all sorts of problems because of the lockdown, so it really, I think, paints a very good perspective on that. But the first point he points out is that an ICU doctor or any doctor, lots of times you're looking for patterns. You know, somebody maybe has a urinary tract infection. Maybe they have some kind of resistance to antibiotics. Maybe they're a diabetic. Maybe they've got high blood pressure. You very quickly start looking at patterns. And the problem is this doesn't fit very good patterns. He says it reminds you of what you sometimes see in one of those cliched scenes in a movie where a scientist looks up from a microscope and says, "This doesn't seem to behave like anything I've ever seen before." He's finding, for example, that some people actually are suffocating to death without even realizing it. They may have very low oxygen levels, but not even complain about shortness of breath. He says one of the things that's most weird about this COVID-19 disease is that even if the very old in our ICU die in a few days, we're left with 50-something, 60-something, 70-something-year-olds who stay on the ventilators for weeks. And he says we're totally at the mercy of these diseases, watching the lungs sometimes get better one day and worse the next. He says we are well aware of all the various treatments like remdesivir, which we talked about on Friday, or some of the anticoagulation drugs and steroids and plasma and all sorts of other things. But he said really nothing that really dramatically seems to work. And the big issue is, as he talks about these ventilators, is that we see individuals sometimes that are on those ventilators for weeks. And that is really kind of one of those untold stories about COVID-19. He also then reminds us of something we've been talking about, and that is we're having a lot of what you might call non-COVID-19 deaths because people are afraid to go to the hospitals or the emergency room. His quote is, "I have seen multiple major illnesses leading to death that could have been easily prevented by patients coming in earlier. Family members told me that the patient was reluctant to come and get exposed." And we've certainly talked about that. It isn't just that we have economic destruction on one side and medical threats on the other. Because of the lockdown, it isn't just the economy, it's also the individuals that are actually not coming in for various kinds of diagnostic tests. We've talked about whether it's a biopsy or a mammogram or colonoscopy, but others that simply die at home because they did not want to go to the emergency room. And so he also recognizes that we have some very significant economic issues. And he says not ending the self-imposed quarantine will also lead to economic destitution with its own collateral damage, especially people working paycheck to paycheck, and even to our own medical infrastructure that is subsidized by elective cases. And I talked last week in one of my Viewpoints commentaries about the number of hospitals that are hemorrhaging all sorts of funds and maybe are going to go bankrupt if things don't change. And he says we probably do have to open the economy more and more because it's just a matter of a couple of months before it even becomes worse. And even in the last few months, we've entered into historical levels of unemployment. And so he recognizes that if this continues, supermarkets will go empty, farms will go unfarmed and turned into dust bowls, animals will be euthanized, economic energy necessary for research and mass producing a cure might not even be there. And he said this tremendous suffering and death in either direction isn't due to a political party or a person. This is due to the virus. And I thought it was a really good piece and brings some balance into a discussion that goes one direction or the other, because you are now starting to see more and more people, and I'll talk about one advisor with the Centers for Disease Control that have warned that, if anything, we may be undercounting the number of people that are dying of COVID-19. And you can go to my Viewpoints commentary, which aired on April 23rd, in which I pointed out both are equally true at the same time. First of all, we do have some individuals that are actually listed as dying from COVID-19, and the reason for that is maybe they tested positive or they were assumed to have tested positive. So in some respects, you have maybe an overcount in some cases because, as I've said, there's a difference between dying from the disease and dying with the disease. But the bigger issue, which I also talk about on the April 23rd commentary, is that there have been people dying at home, and they probably did also die of the disease, but they're simply not counted. But the problem is that some who have wanted to defend the president or say that the virus isn't as bad as we think it is have only focused on the first issue of maybe in some cases looking at those individuals that were actually listed as dying of COVID-19 and saying that we've had an overcount, when a lot of people simply believe that there is an undercount. And this is one of the reasons why last week an individual contacted me and asked if I would write a piece, which will come out shortly in the Christian Post, on whether or not Christians are anti-science. And after I wrote the piece, lo and behold, there came up a piece in the New York Times by Matthew Rosenberg, "Fight over virus's death toll opens grim new front in election battle," in which he now starts quoting individuals who want to support the president or deny the extent of the virus as actually arguing that we have an overcount when there's probably pretty good evidence we have, if anything, an undercount. And then goes in and quotes from a number of individuals, one of which is a state senator in Minnesota. Even quotes somebody we've had on this program, Todd Starnes, and points out that Todd Starnes on one particular case referred to climate change as the tooth fairy. Please, Todd, don't do that anymore. And even points out that one time Todd Starnes took a video outside Brooklyn Hospital in which he said, "See, there's nobody out there in line." Of course, days later, guess what? You had all sorts of people in line, and we're not well served by individuals sometimes that are trying to challenge the media narrative, which sometimes is wrong. I just pointed out some examples of media bias. So all that to simply say, there may be a real need over the next couple of weeks to simply say, you know what, Christians aren't anti-science. But as we've pointed out before, when you question some of the models, when people say believe the science, really what they mean is believe the models, and yet we know the models are wrong. But do we believe that there is an undercount or an overcount? Probably better evidence that there is an undercount for people that have died at home that were never tested for COVID-19. So we're going to have to fight a battle now, I think, over the next couple of weeks as to whether or not we're anti-science or anti-virus. And you see some of that showing up in some of the articles being written in everything from the New York Times to some of the commentaries out there. So if nothing else, that's just one more topic we will address here on Point of View. If you'd like to know a little bit more about some of the things we've posted on the website, they're all available at pointofview.net. When we come back, I thought we'd take a break from the pandemic for a while and talk about the arts. It's a conversation we had recently, and we'll have it again with Dr. Reg Grant and Steve Miller. All that coming up right after this.
"2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View.
And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, I thought we would spend some time talking about Christians' view of the arts, and that is something we've talked about here on Point of View. And I think you're really going to enjoy this hour in this conversation, because we have in studio with us Dr. Reg Grant. He is the chairman and senior professor at the Department of Media Arts and Worship at Dallas Theological Seminary. He's been teaching there since 1977, and as an individual that serves on the board of directors of groups like Insight for Living and a variety of others, we have information about him and some of his books and his website. And I've also even posted one of the conversations of the Table podcast on theology and the arts, some material that I thought you would find helpful, and you will certainly want to look at some of those videos. So, Reg Grant, just great to have you in studio.
Thank you. Good to be here, Kerby. Good to see you again.
I might just mention, too, my incredible debt of gratitude to you, because I was just thinking 4 of the 5 of producers we've had at Point of View over the last almost 2 decades have all come from the media arts program.
Oh,
so
that's great.
You have certainly been providing such an incredible number of great students. Now, the reality was, until we get to Steve, who I'm going to introduce in just a minute, they all came for about 18 months and then went somewhere else. But I felt like I was sort of the finishing school for some of them. But if nothing else, you have done such a great job in the media arts program. Let's talk about that for just a minute, because it's something I would hope some of our listeners might want to participate with.
We started the media arts program a number of years ago at DTS because there has been and continues to be such a demand for artists of different stripes in the local church. So our heartbeat is really for the local church and to provide media specialists in that environment. We have some who are like Naima Lett, who has gone out to L.A. as an actor out there. She is discipling young actors and providing scholarships. And she was sort of on the side of the ledger of the person who's going to go out and hang out their own shingle and do their own thing. And she still does church work, but her primary professional occupation is as an actor and in training other actors.
Very good.
She's with Let's Rise, and it just does a wonderful job. So we have a bit of a split between those going into local church ministry and those going into more of the secular environment, but with a Christian worldview.
So again, we have information about that on your website. We also have your website and DTS and all the rest. And of course, one of the individuals that we are so blessed to have is the producer of Point of View, which is Steve Miller. And of course, you were the one that suggested him. And this has been a great opportunity for us to not only have him produce this program and understand all of that, but gives him enough of a basis so that he can go out and do some acting. So Steve, it's just great to have you on this side of the glass once again.
Well, it's great to be here. I appreciate including me. And let me voice my debt of gratitude to Reg Grant as well. It's mutual admiration society here going on. But Reg has meant so much to my wife April and I over the years, and taught me a lot about how to do what we do as actors and as believers. And something you and I talked about the other day, Reg, was this idea that you mentioned of Jesus representing the Father and how we as artists represent or represent him. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think when students come to DTS in the arts program and they're looking for, they aren't really looking for us to teach them from ground zero how to act. They're looking for a good biblical and theological foundation for their acting. So, most people wouldn't think, most people would wonder what in the world does acting have to do with representing God? And it has a great deal to do with representing God, because most people have a bit of a faulty understanding of what real acting is. Acting is not putting on masks. The best acting is removing masks, removing your own, and then surreptitiously removing the mask of the audience so that they become vulnerable and impacted by the truth you're trying to present. The Lord Jesus did that himself. There are a number of passages where in the book of John, most of them contained in the book of John, where the Lord says that in John 5 and 19 and 30, he says that he could do nothing on his own initiative, only what he saw the Father doing. In a little bit later, he says that he could say nothing on his own initiative, only what he heard the Father speaking. You put those two things together, and it sounds like Jesus was the most unoriginal man who ever lived, because he never did things independent of the Father. There's a kind of a binding principle in all of Western art that is the name of it is mimesis. Mimesis. Yes. And it means basically the way that Aristotle and Plato used it. It means copying or representing. But here's the distinction theologically: not representing in as if Jesus were in the carpenter shop of his earthly father Joseph, and Joseph says, "Hey, listen, son, here's how you shape wood, or here's how you frame stone. Now you do exactly what you see me doing." And Jesus copies him doing that. That's not mimesis, not theologically. It is more the idea of a mirror. If you look in a mirror, you know, who moved first? The person in the mirror or the person initiating the action? Well, they're the same. They're inseparable. There is no time lag. So when Jesus represents the Father, he does it as if in a mirror, as if seeing the Father and Jesus' actions are one and the same. So much so that in John 14, when he's talking to Philip, Philip's a kind of a backseat guy. You know, he doesn't talk a lot, and you know, it's sort of the last night that they're together. This is right before the high priestly prayer in John 17, and I can imagine Philip sitting back there saying, "Boy, you know, I really should say something to impress the master. What could I come up? I know. Hey, Lord, just show us the Father, and it'll be enough." And Jesus looks at him, and he says, "Philip, have I been with you this long, and you don't know if you've seen me? You've seen the Father." Not the same person, but a perfect representation of the Father. And then Jesus prays for us in 17 to be able to do the same thing in the world, representing him to the world. And he gives us this wonderful ministry of the Holy Spirit that shapes us into the character of Jesus Christ and allows us to share that with the world. So when the people see us, hopefully, Lord willing, they will see Jesus at work in our lives and be drawn to him.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Dr. Reg Grant in studio with us today, and Steve Miller. We also have a link to your website, so we're going to talk about that a little bit later, and also some great material that you may want to take advantage of. And I hope this is an encouragement to some of you that maybe would like to use your artistic talents in one way or another, and also might encourage you to find out more about the Department of Media, Arts, and Worship at Dallas Theological Seminary, because that is certainly a place where you get some more of that training, at least to understand the theological basis for some of these issues in the arts. So let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover. If nothing else, you learned a little bit more about what mimesis means, and we'll talk about that and much more right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The latest issue of Harvard University's magazine has an article by the faculty director of the Child Advocacy Program blasting homeschool as dangerous. She documents what she sees as the risks of homeschooling and is disturbed that parents can exercise authoritarian control over their kids. It might be tempting to merely write this off as just another radical professor expressing an opinion that isn't necessarily shared by others on the faculty. But consider that Harvard Magazine's cover features this article and that the university is hosting a conference in June of experts who will be willing to raise the alarm of the dangers of homeschooling. One guest to my radio program talked about how this would progress. State legislators would introduce bills to control homeschooling. Then they would point to the Harvard conference and academic articles warning about homeschooling in order to win over fellow legislators and governors. The article in Harvard Magazine argues that parents want to homeschool their kids in order to isolate them from ideas and values central to our democracy. Actually, surveys done of homeschool parents find that a concern about the school environment, such as safety, drugs, or negative peer pressure, was the number one reason. The number two reason was dissatisfaction with the academic instruction at other schools. Over the last few weeks, I've argued on air that the current lockdown that requires students to stay home have shown parents two things. First, how hard their kids' teachers have to work to educate their kids. Second, how much better their kids' behavior is when at home and away from some of the negative influences in public school. Some of those parents might conclude that homeschooling is better for their kids, which is why some educational elites are starting to warn about the dangers of homeschooling. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again as we talk about kind of the theology of the arts, and if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212, or just simply sit back and listen as we are privileged to have in studio with us today Dr. Reg Grant, as well as Steve Miller. We have a link, first of all, to myunderstudy.com. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Also, I just posted one of the many videos that comes from Dallas Seminary on the Table podcast, that one on theology and the arts, but there are so many others that you can learn from as well. And if in some respects you have an artistic talent of some sort or another, we want to encourage you and even talk about this. But Steve, I think we were talking about mimesis just a minute ago and mirror, but I think we have some other very obvious questions to ask.
Yeah, first of all, I just so appreciate the richness that you bring to this, Reg, with a biblical base out of John, and the idea of reflecting the Father. And, you know, there's nothing new under the sun. Mm-hmm. And centuries later, a millennia and a half later, you know, William Shakespeare wrote in Hamlet, when Hamlet is giving the speech to the players, he talks about holding a mirror up to nature. Okay? Mm-hmm. You mentioned mimesis, and we hold a mirror up to nature. And you and I have talked about that, and you had a nice addition to that, kind of a fine-tuning or a tweaking or a further understanding of what that looks like to us as believers. Could you elaborate?
I think the advice that Hamlet gives to the senior player, and it's the guy that runs the company. Uh-huh. So this is a man with experience, and Hamlet is giving him all of these directions as to how to play the part. And the best that I think the world can do is to hold a mirror up to nature, like Hamlet said. If I hold a mirror up to nature, I'm reflecting reality as I see it. Right? And that's honest, and that has integrity, and that has a certain degree of authority. But I think that the Christian artist whose job it is to represent God in life, as well as characters on a stage, can do more than hold a mirror up to nature. Our goal is to reflect the Father and Jesus Christ, so that what happens with a person is that we open a window into heaven. We help our viewers, our audience, see what they can be, not what they are. Sometimes that's not a real pretty picture, but what they can become only in Christ, and only as God's Holy Spirit reframes that person into the image of Jesus Christ. So I think that, oddly enough, kind of ironically and paradoxically, the way to discover your real uniqueness as a created being is to reflect the one who created you. And in that representation, we discover that which is truly unique to our character that he has created in us.
So when you look at a story that leaves you kind of hanging at the end, and there's a lot of great films out there and great stories, that at the end you wonder, but what now? Like, it may paint a fairly bleak picture, but at the end, when we as Christians view a story that seems to have, I'm a fan of Flannery O'Connor's. People who know me will attest, right? So at the end of some of her stories, A Good Man is Hard to Find, for instance, it doesn't end well. So what about that? And she was a believer. So what about that can we look at and say, this is how to open the window into heaven past that?
Yeah, I think that, I wish that one of my colleagues were here with me. I work with a gentleman named Dr. Tim Basselin down at Dallas Theological Seminary. He did his doctoral work on O'Connor.
Oh, wow.
And we have some good, oh man, this guy is great, and focuses on disability studies, because O'Connor was afflicted with her own disability and a lot of pain in her too short life.
Yeah.
When you take something like A Good Man is Hard to Find, which is pretty doggone dark, and you end it the way that O'Connor ended it, she doesn't wrap it up with a bow.
Right.
It is reality, but it is one of the three essentials that inform our view of art: goodness, beauty, and truth. Now, O'Connor's focus in that one is on truth.
Right.
But in that truth, there are possibilities, there are avenues to explore in terms of really getting into a character and understanding a character, that character's motivations, and what are the possibilities that have been missed along the way.
Right.
And so that invites us to examine our own character and see possibilities in our own lives that maybe we are neglecting or haven't seen or have been obfuscated by some besetting sin or weakness.
You mentioned Naima, our friend out in LA, Naima Lett, who I worked with. I just the other day watched a short film that she and I had done together.
Oh, really?
Forever. Mike Madden did the EDOC Festival.
Oh, really?
Remember that? The short
sure.
film festival, the Eighth Day of Creation Film Festival. She's out there doing some things that some would say, well, you're not doing Christian work. I mean, we use the phrase sometimes wrongly, I think, Christian as an adjective. We use the phrase Christian art. And the assumption can be that once you become a Christian, if you're an artist, if you're a singer, if you're an actor, if you're a painter, you need to do Christian/sacred work. Okay, and I think that gives us a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to represent. So, can you elaborate on that? In other words, why is it that that we as a culture think that that's the way it needs to be?
Yeah.
When you're a singer, you need to go to contemporary Christian music. You need to go gospel. If you're a painter, you need to paint biblical themes. We know that's not true, right?
Right. That's. I think that we need an adjustment to our understanding of what sacred means.
Yeah.
Everything is sacred. If the intent behind it is to glorify the Lord, then our work is sacred work. Whether you're a plumber or an electrician or a gaffer on a set or an actor, your work is sacred because it is set apart to the glory of God. And it doesn't have to be the subject matter that I deal with. It doesn't have to be so truncated It doesn't have to be so narrowly defined as to be what pejoratively perhaps we would call stained glass. It doesn't need to. I don't need to put a Bible verse on a beautifully painted mountain scene in order to justify it as art. It is art because it is beautiful and it corresponds to the beauty of God who inspired that art. So as I am acting, as I'm living out my life, as I focus on Philippians 4 and goodness and beauty and truth and all of the long list that's there in Philippians 4, things that I should be meditating on, then in that way, regardless of what I'm doing, regardless of the particular action, and I'm assuming not doing anything that would be, prohibited by the Bible. Mm-hmm. But if our goal and our calling is to represent Jesus Christ dressed like a mechanic or dressed like an actor, then that's good. And that's beautiful, and that's true.
We interviewed Bruce Herman a week, 2 weeks ago. I lose track.
Yeah, just recently.
Up in Massachusetts at Gordon College. And as we were talking, I'm going to quote again one of my favorite quotes from that I first read in Steve Turner's book Imagine, and it's a quote by T-Bone Burnett, and he said, "If Jesus is the light of the world, I can write songs about the light, or I can write songs about what I see by the light." He said, "That's what I do." So I think some of that relates to what you're saying there. We write about the things that we see because of our relationship with Jesus.
Yeah. Do you remember that C.S. Lewis quote? You remember the C.S. Lewis quote about viewing down the beam of the light?
Yes.
I can't remember it exactly. We'll have to look that one up, but it's exactly what I thought of. It's that similar thing, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think walking in the light is the best way to be a revealer of the light. As we are conforming, or allowing God through His Spirit to conform us to the image of Christ, we become light bearers, and that's the joy of it.
Yeah. Let's take a break, and when we come back, let me just encourage you during the break to go to a couple of the websites we've provided, myunderstudy.com, wordshaper.net, dts.edu, and a variety of others, because those are all resources that you can benefit from some of the work of Dr. Reg Grant. And we'll see if we can find that C.S. Lewis quote in just a minute, which we've used on more than one occasion, even on this program as well. And when we come back, we'll get into a couple more aspects of how to think about truth and beauty and art and all sorts of different aspects of that, and it's just a great opportunity to have Dr. Reg Grant in studio and Steve Miller. And for many of you, you have a chance every once in a while to talk to him when you call in, but now we get a chance to see him in studio once again. And we've had a couple of these great programs on the arts, and if you have a young person that maybe is thinking about wanting to use their artistic talents for the glory of God, we wanted this particular conversation to encourage them, but also maybe point them in some directions where they can find some great information about that and really develop a Christian theology of the arts. So let's take a break. We're only half done, and we have a lot more to cover, but let's take a break. And if you would like to join the conversation, you can call us, 1-800-351-1212, or mostly just sit back and maybe visit some of those websites, which we'll talk about right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation with Dr. Reg Grant and Steve Miller about a Christian view of the arts. One of the things we have on our website right now, and I encourage you to go there, myunderstudy.com. I mentioned a minute ago word shaper, but now that's all subsumed under that. So I'm a few hours too late, and all of that can now be found at myunderstudy.com. Talk about what's available there, because you have some great resources.
Oh, thanks. We have had such a great time putting My Understudy together. Just a brief history of My Understudy, how it came about. I have traveled with Dr. Chuck Swindoll for since about 2000, maybe 2001. And over the course of those years, I've been taking Bible characters. Chuck and I sort of do a tag team thing. He preaches, and I'm sort of the dancing monkey and come out and do my little bit of acting and present biblical characters. And over the years, people started saying, hey, can we get those? And until now, there was no way to get the characters that I presented on tour. So on location in Israel and so on. So we decided to put together 10 of them to start out with. And my sons, Gabe and Nick Grant, were kind enough to come down and shoot them in video them, and then edit them and add the music, all that kind of thing. So we designed myunderstudy.com with the great help of Marcus Raven. He's my web designer and good friend and former student from the program.
Yes.
He put this together and did a wonderful job, and people can go to My Understudy now and access all 10 characters, plus Bible study guides for leaders and Bible study guides for students, with tons of links embedded in those resources. And for the next, I think it's the next 2 weeks, you can see a countdown clock if you go to myunderstudy.com. We're going to give a 50% off offer on that for the next couple of weeks. So go now and plug in, and hopefully we'll get some feedback from you and find out how we can make them even better.
Well, and again, just a great opportunity for people that have always wanted to do that, because I've seen individuals going into character. Some do it better than others. Reg, of course, at the top of the group there. But again, just to have a chance to look at some of these characters like Barnabas and Esau and Jabesh and John and Patmos and Jonah and Joseph and Peter and Simon and all those. It's just really great material. So thank you so much for making that available. And Steve, I would imagine some of these churches that are looking for something that they could use will benefit tremendously by what is available at myunderstudy.com.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you've been listening and you think, oh, this is theoretical and academic, and man, it's very practical. And I watched you do that monologue, the Esau monologue on the website, and I've known you for years, 20 plus years now, and I thought, wait, is that Reg? So you did.
Who is that guy?
You did a great job as a dancing monkey, much better than a dancing monkey, I think. So Esau was it was fabulous. So it's very practical stuff. This is where the storytelling comes to life, where holding the mirror up to nature and opening the window into heaven, that puts on shoes, where the rubber hits the road, whatever metaphor you want to use. And so I appreciate what you're doing there. Just because I had to look this quote up finally, the C.S. Lewis quote we were trying to come up with. Yeah, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. I think T-Bone Burnett stole that, but it does let us know that is what our job as Christians in this arena is to reveal things like that.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, I think that. Oh, by the way, I should credit the reason that you didn't recognize me right off the bat is due to the great work of Gigi Coker, who has been my makeup artist for
it's really impressive.
Decades.
I look at some of these and go, that just cannot be you.
Oh boy, I looked in the mirror and said the same thing.
Yeah.
It's sort of like getting up in the mirror this morning and saying, "Oh, what's that? What's?" But I really, really appreciate the work that Gigi has done, and she's been with me for a long time and does great work. Yes, I think that the idea of living this idea of living in the light and being light bearers is one that frees you up. It doesn't restrict you. It gives you the freedom to explore goodness, beauty, and truth, and you find truth in the most unexpected, unanticipated areas. The character that you mentioned, Esau, was such of all of the characters that I've done, and I've got maybe around 30 different characters total that I do. Esau was the biggest surprise. I found something in that man's character in researching him that stunned me, and the elements of grace and forgiveness and rough around the edges. Yes, indeed, no doubt about that. I would not want to meet him in a dark alley. But the work that God did in his life, later in his life, is pretty remarkable. And that's part of what we bring to the table when we're examining these characters. Each character has something surprising about him that we weren't quite prepared for, and that helps us live our life in a more beautiful way.
Mm-hmm. Well, and in some respects, when you think about this, the Old Testament is character studies. You really don't know a lot about the New Testament disciples. You know that, well, I guess we have to say that Simon Peter was married because he has a mother-in-law and things like that, but you really don't know much of anything. But, boy, you can really see the broken branches on your family tree when you go through the book of Genesis, can't you?
Yeah, you really can. There are numbers of people in the Old Testament even in the New Testament, who have no given name, and yet they play important roles in the gospel, in the preparation for the gospel, in serving a king well. The Jabesh hero, who has no given name in Scripture, and yet he was one of the bravest men, not a soldier, just an average guy, but he did the right thing, and that inspires us to do the same.
You said something about Esau that was so fascinating, and we talked on the break about those discoveries, especially with Esau, and feeling the sympathy and feeling that sort of, I get in a sense, it's beautiful, it's grace that you see that you didn't expect. As an actor, I know you've been there, and we get these rare times, I think, on stage where we begin to grow and connect as the piece is progressing, as the play is progressing. And I think it's a beautiful analogy to our lives. We think we know, right? We think we know this character. We think we know the word. We think we know the story. And then as we are living it out, we come into these realizations of, oh my goodness, this is what it is, or I never thought of it this way. It's a little bit frightening sometimes when you hit that moment with the character on stage in the middle of a performance. But it does, in a sense, lift you beyond the character.
And isn't it amazing that it always happens, even when you're doing solo work? Which I don't have the joy of working with other actors usually. Usually it's solo work up in front of an audience. It happens in the context of community. Even when you're doing solo work, it happens when you give, and you're not just a giver, you are somebody who is creating this kind of synergistic loop with an audience, and they respond. So you've got this conversation going, and as they respond, you discover something that was not previously discovered before. It's a surprise, and it's due to the involvement and the participation of the audience. We cannot allow the audience the luxury of observation. If we do, they'll applaud and they'll say, "Oh, great, that was a really nice performance," but they will not have been involved. If they participate, if we're conversing with one another, then lives get changed.
Yeah, we engage them. Yeah, and that's why every performance can be different.
Yeah,
right. And you discover and you learn and you grow.
Never dip your toes into the same act twice. The same way, never. The same way, like the old proverb, you never dip your toes into the same stream twice.
Right.
Even though you're in the same place doing the same thing, it's a different river. It's the same thing with every single performance, that even though you've done it how many times.
Yeah. It's fascinating. And if you're on Broadway and you're doing hundreds of shows, this becomes a challenge.
Got to keep that perspective.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, let's take a break, but let me just mention that as you go to that website we just talked about, myunderstudy.com, we have a 3-minute video that you can watch there of you playing Esau. So if you say, well, I wonder what that looks like, well, you can actually see that. And if you'd like to encourage people to find out more, you can also hit that share button, and you could actually put it on your Facebook page or your Twitter feed, and people go, where did you find that? And so that might also help educate some other individuals, especially, wasn't it still 50% off? Hasn't changed in the last few minutes, so that's just a great opportunity for you to find out a little bit more. We have a lot more to cover, but we have, again, one of those mandatory breaks. We are in studio today with Dr. Reg Grant and Steve Miller, who's the producer of Point of View, and 2 actors in front of me here, and it's just been great to watch that conversation unfold. But we need to take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue that conversation. But I would encourage you to go to myunderstudy.com, maybe watch that video, maybe post it somewhere, and see what kind of response you get. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. In studio with us today, Dr. Reg Grant and Steve Miller.
Yeah, Reg, we had talked about the tendency that sometimes we as Christians have to be rather isolationist in the way we view things. And you and I talked about Martin Luther, which you should know. You've done a little bit of research and written a novel on the guy. And you talked about the monastery walls. His background was he came from a monastery.
Yeah.
He was saved out of that. What's the analogy? Elaborate on that analogy of the monastery walls and breaking those
Well,
down.
this isn't a new problem that we're facing. This idea of engaging culture, or dialoguing with culture, perhaps would be a better phrase. Back in the 16th century, I mean, Luther was if I'm remembering right, a conventual, a convent. Think convent, conventual. And the basic attitude was you keep the walls up, you keep the drawbridge up, and you go inside the convent or the monastery to keep yourself pure from the world. Well, the problem with that is you never impact the world.
Right.
If you're going to remain unstained by the world, and you keep the walls up, you're never going to have an impact on the world. So Luther, who bought into that, went to Rome to try to talk to the powers that be there to try to convince them that no, this was the right thing, because there was this movement called the observantist movement that countered the conventual movement. And while Luther was there conversing with his old mentor, Johann von Staupitz changed his mind. One of the few chances in the 16th century where I read Luther changing his mind about anything. And he said, this is right. We're going to lower the drawbridge. We're actually going to go into the world and still trust God to keep us unstained by the world, but share the light. Because if the walls are up, where's the light going to go? Light's going to come back on you. It's instead of sharing it with other people. So it's the same old problem that we've got. We fear contamination, and so we remain inside our cloistered walls and not visiting, not dialoguing, not risking sharing the gospel with people who are desperately in need of it.
Yeah, the culture, I think, tends to move in cycles. And back in the late 70s, with the movement of the moral majority and the far right, as it were, the religious right, which I heard someone once say that the moral majority was a response on the part of Christians who were angry that the world had stopped behaving like the church. Do you think? Yeah. Right? So sometimes we do tend to isolate, don't we? We tend to say, and we tend to also, I think, use art. Once someone is saved, okay, take this art, take this painting, take this song, take this play, and use it as a didactic tool. And it serves what we think is the greater good of the gospel, which is not always the case.
Yeah,
right?
Great art does not have to be functional.
It does
in order
not.
To be fantastic. It needs to represent goodness, beauty, and truth with integrity, and then trust God for the outcome of that. When students come to DTS and they enter the program, one of the greatest joys of teaching in this program is giving the student permission to be what God created them to be, because for so long they have been corseted and restricted in their expression. And we say, no, this is how God made you. This is a good thing. Now let's explore this together. And oh my goodness, to see that light come on, to see those students just explode out into the world and cross that drawbridge into culture and start revealing Jesus Christ. It's one of the greatest, what's kept me at the seminary since 76, 77.
You and I had a talk the other day, and you mentioned the work that you do at DTS, and you used that phrase, leaving a legacy, saying that as you progress, as you mature in your life, and you realize this increasing need to leave a legacy. What does that look like for you personally, and what does that look like for you there at DTS?
I think that all of us should be, who are in our age group, our more mature age group, should be thinking along with the younger generation. Millennials need to be thinking about this too.
Yeah.
The kind of work that I'm going to leave behind, is it the kind of work that I want others to see, others to engage with, others to emulate in carrying goodness, beauty, and truth out into the world? Or is it something that's so ephemeral that it's basically nothing but a sort of a sanctified sitcom that will pass away, and no one will remember what you did or why you did it 2 weeks down the road? We want to embrace the character of Christ, who is eternal, the same yesterday, today, and forever, and move forward in the phalanx of faith, getting out there in front and leading people to an understanding and an embracing of the Lord Jesus. That's what we want to do.
You showed a video to me, to a class when I was at DTS, and it was, I believe it was just called Acting Shakespeare, and it was Ian McKellen from the early 80s,
yeah,
right?
right.
And it was Ian McKellen doing a one-man show.
Solo work, right.
It was a solo job where he talked about, he gave a commentary on the work of Shakespeare. He played multiple parts. He addressed the audience directly. It was autobiographical. It was wonderful. And the thing that stuck with me besides the brilliance of that, was afterwards, basically what you said was, dare we do any less in our preparation of presenting the gospel in that way?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. There's an album, believe it or not, I don't even know if it's on CD anymore, and CDs are going the way of the dinosaur, of Laurence Olivier reading the Bible. Now, anyone who knows anything about Sir Larry knows that there are perhaps he experimented with things that probably we would not want to experiment with. He's a brilliant actor, though.
Yeah.
And when he reads Genesis, and the Lord God is speaking to Cain after the murder of Abel, and he says, in a little short line that's just, most people would just, it's a throwaway line, the three words of attribution, and he said. But when Olivier said, and he said, and he said. And you heard a wounded father.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that when I play that for my students, they just sit there with their mouths open, because how can a man who is not devoted to Christ, as far as we know, lend so much authority and empathy to the reading of "and he said"? If he can do it, as you said, Steve, then how much more should we who love Jesus want to do a good job?
Yes. Well, I wish we had more time, but we are out of time. But Steve, thank you for making this possible. And Reg Grant, thanks for coming in studio
today. It was a
today.
blessing as always. Kerby, thank you. Thank you, Steve.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Let me encourage you, if you've said, boy, that came pretty fast, or maybe you know somebody that would like to hear it again, we have an opportunity for you to actually download the podcast, and it'll also be showing up pretty soon on YouTube so that you can watch it or see it. And so maybe you'd like to listen to it again. Maybe you know somebody that would really be encouraged to think about how to use their gifts in the artistic realm. Or if they'd like to go to Dallas Seminary, you can go, it's dts.edu, right?
Yes, sir.
And find out a little bit more about the Department of Media Arts and Worship. So, yes. Reg Grant, just been great to have you in studio. And thank you for providing all the producers over the years that you have, including welcome. This one that stayed around a little bit longer than the rest. So I hope that you have really enjoyed this conversation about the arts, and I hope that you will take the time to really apply this to your life in the future. Thank you for listening today to Point of View.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team. and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and